Hi, I'm Brittany, a neurodivergent mum and speech pathologist. This is Not Just Theories, where I share what actually works in my real, messy life. Because life doesn't follow a theory. Here's what I actually do. Hello, and welcome back to Not Just Theories. Today, I will be continuing my series on infant sleep. And I'm going to be talking about something that doesn't get enough attention in mainstream sleep advice, which are food allergies or intolerances. Because sometimes when a baby is waking constantly and is very unsettled and feeding very frequently and therefore struggling with sleep, it's not a sleep habit. It can be a gut problem. Because when babies are uncomfortable in their bodies, sleep becomes incredibly difficult. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how allergies can show up in babies, why they're often missed, how they can affect sleep, and a little bit about what the reality of managing elimination diets is when you're postpartum. I'll be talking a bit about some of the personal experiences I've had with my children, because for us, this piece of the puzzle was huge. As always, this is not medical advice, but I do want to share our experiences in the hopes that if this is something that's relevant to you, you'll feel more confident advocating when you do visit your provider and finding out if this is something that's affecting your child's sleep. For us, one of the really tricky things was that the symptoms of infant allergies can look like a lot of other things, particularly in those really early days. And they're often really dismissed as just normal newborn fussiness, reflux, colic, or your child might even just be labelled as a tricky sleeper. But if you zoom out and look at the full pattern, sometimes the picture can become clearer. So in our case, the symptoms included mucus in stools, very frequent stools, sometimes one per feed, runny stools well beyond that really early newborn stage, and significant reflux. And when I say reflux, I mean the kind where every feed ended with an outfit change for both of us. There was also constant fussiness and back arching and signs of discomfort after feeding and poor sleep and extremely frequent breastfeeding. And finally, the final symptom that managed to get us the diagnosis was blood appearing in my child's nappies. So thinking about some of those symptoms, things like frequent breastfeeding in itself is not automatically a problem. But in our case, it was happening alongside plenty of wet nappies and heavy nappies, which suggested that constant feeding wasn't about milk supply, even though that was the original diagnosis, milk supply issue. It actually was more about comfort and regulation. Another sign that we really experienced was poor weight gain, which can sometimes happen when babies are burning a lot of energy, managing discomfort, all of that constant squirming and unable to stay still, and also just not absorbing the nutrition properly because their gut was in such a high state of inflammation. So none of these signs on their own necessarily scream allergy, but together they paint a picture. So it wasn't, I think we spent the first 8 weeks of my kid's life back and forth with nurses and GPs, just mostly focused in on the sleep, but also wondering about reflux and some of the other things. And I remember being told by a few different people, oh, all babies spit up. But actually, no, not all babies vomit most of their feed back up again. Most babies don't need to change their entire outfit after every feed when feeds are happening, 10 or 12 times a day. I mean, the amount of washing was just obscene. And I think it's really easy to be dismissed when you're a first-time parent that some of these things are just normal and you weren't expecting it. But again, in hindsight, I was worried, and it was for a good reason. The reflux significantly decreased when I addressed the cow's milk protein allergy. It didn't completely go away. I talked last episode about how I wish I'd also tried reflux medication. But, it's again that idea that parents are the experts in their child. And if a parent is concerned about something, there's usually a pretty good reason for it. Something I'm going to talk about right now is the difference between like a cow's milk protein allergy or an intolerance and lactose intolerance, because they are not the same thing. Lactose intolerance is difficulty digesting lactose, which is the sugar in milk. And a true lactose intolerance in a baby is life-threatening because there is lactose in breast milk in and of itself, and it can be like usually within a few days, baby will have extremely high jaundice levels, really poor weight gain, and it can cause a lot of really significant medical issues. So a true lactose intolerant in an infant is really rare, though not impossible. And cutting lactose out of a breastfeeding parent's diet does absolutely nothing. So we're not talking about lactose intolerance. A cow's milk protein allergy or a cow's milk protein intolerance, often shortened to CMPA or CMPI, is a reaction to the protein in cow's milk, not the sugar, the protein. And these proteins can pass into breast milk if a breastfeeding parent consumes dairy. So your baby can react even though they are not directly drinking cow's milk. Although obviously if your baby is on a cow's milk-based formula, you might see actually even stronger symptoms from earlier on. So these symptoms can be really delayed and more subtle than you might expect. So instead of something like immediate hives or anaphylaxis, if it's a non-IgE mediated allergy, you might see the gut symptoms, reflux, sleep disruption, discomfort, eczema, all of those sorts of things. And it can make it quite hard to figure out what's going on. One of the biggest challenges with CMPA is that an elimination diet for that breastfeeding parent often has to be really strict. And you never know for your particular child just how strict you need to be until you've done it for a little while, because some babies react even to tiny, tiny traces of dairy protein. By definition, if they're already reacting through your breast milk, they're already reacting to a small amount that's managed to transfer from your diet into your blood, into your breast milk. So your child is already more sensitive than someone who might be reacting directly to formula. But these tiny traces of dairy protein might be as simple as food that was cooked in a pan that had previously had somebody cook something in butter in it. Or it might be dairy ingredients in processed foods, even when that dairy ingredient is right at the end of the list, or is a dairy-based emulsifier or something like that. Some children even react when the parent has a product like a wine that was filtered using dairy proteins, and there are trace amounts of dairy proteins left in that wine, and that parent has a very small amount of wine, and that very small amount of wine contains an extremely tiny amount of dairy protein that passes into the breast milk. So for different families, when they talk about eliminating dairy, we're often talking about just complete elimination, not just avoiding obvious dairy foods or, oh yes, I won't have a full coffee on milk, but I'll have a little bit of milk in my tea. It's complete elimination for most families. Some children might just be dairy sensitive and do okay with less, but most of the families that I know who've had this, it's been complete elimination. And this kind of protein allergy or intolerance doesn't just happen for cow's milk protein. So that is the most common one, but other allergens can be involved. So for one of the most common other examples is the soy protein allergy. And sometimes this is a bit of a cross-reactivity thing where the soy protein is very similar to the dairy protein in size and shape, and so the body's reacting for the same reason. And these kinds of multiple reactions or cross-reactions can cause somebody's diet to become really restrictive, really very quickly. And this is the part that I think people really often underestimate. Eliminating an entire food group while caring for a newborn is incredibly challenging. It's challenging at any point in time. For me, with my first child, I was already vegetarian and had been for a number of years. And then on top of that vegetarian diet, I had to eliminate dairy, soy, and egg, including all traces of dairy, soy, and egg. So that removed a huge portion of my usual diet. My main protein source at that point were things like lentils and beans. That was all that was really left after I eliminated dairy, soy, egg, and meat. So I was basically basically vegan for the first time while breastfeeding a child and recovering from surgery. So that was quite hard health-wise. It was manageable, but it was really challenging, especially because I wasn't just vegan. I did also have to worry about things like cross-contamination and tiny traces and things like the dairy protein in the wine and in bath products and things like that. With my second child, things got even more complicated because in addition to dairy, soy, and egg, I actually needed to eliminate all legumes. So he reacted to what we call pea protein, which is much more common now than it used to be. And in hindsight, I'm wondering whether this is something I just never figured out for my eldest child because she did eat a lot of legumes. And we're wondering whether maybe that was part of the reason her sleep issues lasted such a long time. But once I was eliminating dairy, soy, egg, and legumes, I actually had to start eating meat again after so many years of being vegetarian. Not because I wanted to, but because nutritionally I needed to recover from birth, provide myself with energy while looking after 2 children, and breastfeed a tiny baby. So all of the foods that I was relying on were gone, and I was having to change my entire lifestyle and eat things that I hadn't eaten for a really long time just to get by. Another one of the biggest practical issues was something that, it sounds really small, but it matters a lot in postpartum life, which is the loss of freezer meals and takeaway, because those are the foods that often get people through the early months. But once you've got multiple allergens involved, most of the pre-prepared freezer meals you might have made before you had your baby might not be safe anymore. Most takeaway options aren't safe, and even buying packaged snacks can become really, really complicated. And that means that food preparation becomes so much harder at a time when energy and time are already extremely limited. There's also a social layer that people don't necessarily talk about very much, which is that a lot of early parenting social activities revolve around food. Mothers groups often meet at cafes. Play dates involve snacks. Celebrations involve shared meals. And when you're managing strict eliminations, those situations become really stressful rather than relaxing. I personally found myself quite often unable to participate in a lot of those activities, and that really added another layer of isolation during what's already a very intense stage of life. And trying to prepare to leave the house with a baby is hard enough when you don't need to bring every bite of food that you want to eat while you're out. At the same time, it's just all this extra preparation, all this extra stuff to carry. And sometimes just it makes you not feel part of a group. So if you turn up to a cafe with your travel mug and your pre-prepared safe snack, people do look at you like you're a bit weird, which is really sad because it's not something you often have a bit of control over. One of the things that was particularly hard is that so many of the reactions are delayed and not clear cut. So you might be making these big sweeping lifestyle changes and you don't see a change immediately. So it feels like, did we figure it out? Or, we've cut out dairy and we've seen a bit of an improvement, but we're still seeing symptoms. And how long is it going to take you to figure out what the other allergens might be? Because those symptoms can appear hours later or the next day or even a couple of days after exposure. Because if you think about the fact that dairy protein has to pass through the mother into the milk and then into the baby and then cause a reaction, there's a delay at each of those steps. And it makes identifying that trigger so difficult. Sometimes you might accidentally eat something that contains dairy and the consequences show up, later that night or even the next night. And so for us, one of the ways that those slips showed up for us was sleep disruption. Even a really small dietary slip, like someone using the same spoon to stir my cup of tea as they'd used to stir someone's cup of tea made with dairy milk, led to a much more unsettled night or increased discomfort or a lot more waking. But because those symptoms were delayed, it wasn't always obvious what had caused it. And I think people took it a lot less seriously than they would have had I been able to say, yes, my child has an anaphylactic allergy and here we have an EpiPen. And I understand that it is a different level of stress to be worrying about anaphylaxis. I'm not comparing it in that respect, but this is an allergy. It's not a preference, and it can cause significant disruption to your child's health. And to have people not consider it important because it doesn't cause anaphylaxis was really, really hard. You know, that whole phrase people would use of, oh, it's just an intolerance. And it's like, well, actually, there's blood in my baby's nappy. They are pooing blood. Like, that is not something to be dismissed. Like, that's significant gut discomfort, and it's affecting their nutrition, because when their gut is that inflamed, they're not absorbing nutrition and they're having poor weight gain and they're, failure to thrive as a diagnosis. And it's all of these awful, awful things. But it was just an allergy, just an intolerance. Some people didn't even realize it was technically an allergy because it was a different type of allergy, that non-IgE mediated allergy. And because it's that non-IgE mediated, you can't do allergy testing for it. So you have to do just the elimination and the tracking of symptoms. It's really, really hard. But what we do know is that gut discomfort and sleep are closely connected, because when a baby's digestive system is inflamed or irritated, particularly that position of lying flat can be so uncomfortable. Because often reflux as a symptom especially makes that lying flat position even more uncomfortable. And that discomfort leads to more night waking, more feeding for comfort, difficulty settling, needing more upright soothing or movement, or needing more time upright after a feed before they can lie down if that reflux is particularly bad. And all of those things can be interpreted as like a sleep habit issue of, oh, they're feeding to sleep and the feeding to sleep is the issue. But sometimes that baby is just trying to manage the discomfort in the only way they can. That soothing behavior of feeding to sleep is often one of the only things that can help provide that relief from the discomfort. And a baby will seek out constant feeding as a way of self-soothing. So if your baby is showing several of the symptoms that I mentioned earlier, especially if you notice blood in their stools, it is worth discussing the possibility of allergies or an intolerance with their healthcare provider. So that investigation process, as I touched on earlier, involves trial elimination of certain foods, and usually you would be recommended to cut out cow's milk protein, which is all dairy foods, including butter, including lactose-free foods. A lot of providers will recommend you cut out dairy and soy at the same time because the cross-reactivity is something like 75%, meaning that if your child reacts to dairy, it's a 75% chance they'll also react to soy. Other providers prefer you to cut out one and then the other, but that probably depends on the whole clinical picture of where is the child at. For us, we cut out both at the same time because we really wanted to try and get our child gaining weight before we then reintroduce soy to test it as its own sort of allergen. You then monitor the symptoms, hope that they get better, and then it's really important to then reintroduce the food later to confirm the pattern. So you're not just cutting things out for 12 months at a time. It's that really important, eliminate something, see whether the symptoms decrease. If they do, that's a first sign. But if you do a reintroduction and the symptoms flare again, that's your confirmation that you've eliminated the right thing. Sometimes it depends on who you're working with, how they do that elimination and reintroduction, but reintroduction is so important because elimination diets can really affect nutrition. And most people doing these elimination diets postpartum are often doing it because they're breastfeeding a baby. So not only are you recovering from childbirth, but you're breastfeeding a child, and you're a person in your own right who deserves to have adequate nutrition for yourself. It's really important to have support when you're doing this kind of elimination diet, particularly if you start cutting out multiple allergens. So that might look like doing it together with a pediatrician or an allergist or a dietitian who specializes in managing pediatric allergies, but just really making sure particularly things like calcium and vitamin D are supplemented. One of the other conversations that often comes up in this context is the suggestion to switch to formula. Many parents are told that it's easier to manage allergies with specialized formula. And for some families, that absolutely is the right choice. But it is also completely valid for parents to want to continue breastfeeding if that is important to them. Breastfeeding can still work with elimination diets, although it can be challenging, particularly once multiple allergens are involved. But parents deserve support in making the decision that fits their values, their capacity, and their circumstances, not pressure in one direction or the other. I was really lucky that the GP that first diagnosed my child's CMPA was quite supportive of me continuing to breastfeed. But I know lots of other people have been told it's too hard, it's not worth it, just switch to formula. So I think that messaging can be really harmful. I think making sure parents know that formula is an option is really valuable, but to say it's not worth it when the decision whether or not breastfeeding is worth it is a decision that the parent who is breastfeeding needs to make, I think that's where providers can really step over the line. So allergies are just one of the many biological factors that can influence sleep. I spoke last week about some of the other ones. Not every baby with sleep difficulties has allergies. But when allergies are present, addressing them can make a significant difference to your child's sleep. For us, once we identified those triggers and eliminated them successfully, the changes were noticeable. We didn't get perfect sleep. It was a really long game, but there was a lot less discomfort for our child, which made sleep easier. So looking ahead to the next episode, I'm going to talk a bit about sensory needs and particularly neurodivergent sleep patterns, because we know that some babies need more movement or more closeness or quite specific sensory environments in order to settle. And understanding those needs can change how we approach sleep entirely. So if you've been listening to this and trying to piece together your own baby symptoms, please remember that you are not imagining things. Parents often notice these kinds of patterns long before they're obvious to everyone else, and curiosity about your child's body is not overreacting. It is how we care for them. So thank you for being here. I hope this has been helpful. I look forward to talking to you again next week. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to Not Just Theories. I really appreciate you being here. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the show is to follow, leave us a rating or review, or just share this episode with someone else who you think might find it comforting or useful. I hope to see you back here soon.